The very simple answer is that the country was run by the Irish Protestant community, the Anglicans, who were associated with the Church of Ireland, which is the sister church to the Church of England. And it was the Protestant community broadly who ran the country through the mechanism of a parliament which sat in Dublin. So that's where all the legislation arose, that's where the legislation was passed. However, there is another layer to the government, because under the terms of what was termed Poyning's Law, there was a requirement that the Parliament pass the fundamental portions of the legislation through the English Privy Council, which meant that the English government, the British government, had effectively a veto over how things were run. So there is in effect a kind of subsidiarity question here. There's one layer of government that's taking place within Ireland itself, but it has a kind of cross-check, a sense check being run through London. Most of the people who sit within the Dublin Parliament, the Irish Parliament, are effectively landowners. They are the aristocratic class of the country, and they come together with, for example, in the House of Lords, the bishops of the Church of Ireland have a say. There's a general sense in which this is the high elite of the society that are coming together to govern the country. That said, there are slightly more popular constituencies where there is a degree of, there's a slightly wider franchise. Dublin in particular is a city where the franchise has some say. So there is an increasing influence of public opinion as the century goes on. There is a widening out of the kind of sense of who the elite is during the century. What you get is the expansion into the burgesses of the town. The Dublin Corporation becomes a hub of a certain kind of politics. So too does Belfast. As Belfast is increasingly expanding through the expansion of the linen industry and sort of what's termed proto-industrialization, you begin to see the emergence of a kind of urban mercantile community, and they become politicized as the century goes along. Prior to 1714, what you're seeing is the development by this Irish Parliament in the wake of the Revolution of 1688 and the war of between James II and William III, which really is a war in Ireland. In the wake of the Battle of the Boyne and the emergence of the Hanoverian regime in 1714, what you're seeing is the development and building of a penal code which keeps Catholic Ireland out of politics and out of social, certain kinds of social arrangements. So there's an attack on the Irish the Catholic landed class. There's an attack on the capacity of the Irish Church to replicate itself, the Catholic Church to replicate itself over time. Almost every time the Irish Parliament meets between 1690 and 1714, they're passing penal legislation. There's also, of course, the Presbyterian community that is primarily based in Ulster but has an outreach into Dublin, and they are also facing certain kinds of penal legislation, notably the 1704 Test Act, which ensures that they are kept out of the Irish Parliament in large part and out of certain kinds of government office. So there's an attempt to create a decidedly homogeneous confessional state in Ireland, and both the Catholics and the Presbyterians are in different ways excluded from that process. That, of course, produces all kinds of political tension. There's constant attempts to try and rethink how the country might work, most notably the Jacobite movement in Ireland, which remains, although it doesn't rebel in the same way as it does in Scotland in 1715 and 1745, the Jacobite threat is in the back of the minds of the Irish Anglicans and very much at the forefront of political life amongst the Catholic community in Ireland in the 18th century. The most obvious example of a tension point is the rising of 1745, which, while, as I mentioned, there wasn't a rising in Ireland, certainly created some degree of anxiety in Ireland in that period. But there's also notably a kind of economic crisis that takes place in 1740, 41, known as a kind of period of deep food dearth and famine. And that creates all kinds of stresses and strains in the society. By the 1760s, you're getting the rise of what's known as of a kind of agrarian radicalism, notably under the guise of the White Boys. And this was a grouping of predominantly Catholic tenants who were attacking the livestock on the country estates in an attempt to kind of protest the conditions under which they were working, in particular the payment of the tithe, which was a payment made by Catholic tenantry to the upkeep of the Church of Ireland, the Protestant Church of Ireland. This was seen to be a serious point of tension, particularly in these periods of economic downturn and dearth. There simply wasn't the money available to support a church that wasn't your own. And you can imagine how that might have produced the kind of social tensions that we're talking about. So what you got was this emergence, particularly in and around Kilkenny and further south, down the east coast, of this white boy agitation. There's an emergence of a strong sense of tension that begins with a kind of mechanics of collaboration and a degree of agreement between the Anglican Parliament in Dublin and the London government. But that slowly begins to change. There are arguments in the 1720s, notably around the imposition of a coin, Wood's halfpence, into Dublin, or into Ireland rather, which the Irish Parliament ultimately looked to resist. This charge is initially led by the writer Jonathan Swift, who writes, he's famed for Gulliver's Travels, but he also writes a major tract known as the Drapier's Letters, which is a protest against the imposition of this coinage. It's an attempt to solve a problem of small coins, but it simply doesn't produce the kind of answer that Swift and his allies want. It's seen to be the British government dictating terms and conditions onto Ireland. So that begins the process of the emergence of what's known as the Patriot movement, which is an attempt to rethink the relationship between the Dublin Parliament and the London Parliament. And as a consequence of that, as it merges through to the 1760s and into the 1770s, what you see is the development of a rethinking of the relationship, which is driven by the idea that the Poynings law that I mentioned earlier and other limitations on the Irish Parliament ought to be rescinded, and that the Irish Parliament ought to be freed up to make its own legislation without the oversight of the British government. That produces an argument which leads you towards what's known as the volunteering movement, which was the beginnings of the radicalisation of Irish politics and the stark polarisation and the kind of militarisation of Irish political life, which characterises the last quarter of the 18th century. One of the key aspects of this is that the Irish volunteering movement itself begins it has its origins in the idea of protecting Ireland from engagement with France, France being an ally with revolutionary America. And so, as a consequence of the move of British troops out of Ireland into America to fight the revolutionary wars, what you get is the opening up of the possibility of a French invasion. That leads to the construction of a militia movement across Ireland known as the Irish Volunteers. And it's they who begin to petition the Dublin Parliament and subsequently create a kind of pressure point around the idea of refashioning the relationship between Ireland and Britain. So the whole of the volunteering crisis and leading to the constitutional revolution of 1782 is a direct consequence of the American crisis. It's also true that the Lord Lieutenant at the time, a man named Lord Carlisle, had been in America and tried to solve the American crisis and took many of the ideas he had back to Ireland to placate the volunteering movement. He's the first one to suggest the idea that the Irish Parliament should be formally released from any oversight from the British government directly. So there are direct lines of communication. The other thing that's going on is that political ideas are circulating through the Atlantic Basin around this idea of effectively subsidiary government, what we would now think of as devolved forms of government. And the constitutional arrangement in Ireland is being watched by American patriots, and American patriots are looking, the Irish are also looking over to America as ideas are circulating around about how the regional governments of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and so on can govern themselves. This kind of culminates in the kind of pamphlet literature that you're seeing, in which people like Washington are becoming heroes of the Irish Patriot movement. There's a understanding that in many ways they are fighting against the centralising forces of a British government, which is a shared problematic. Now, the Americans ultimately split away and go fully independent. The Irish situation is rather different. What they end up doing is continuing their association with Britain, but having a much freer parliamentary organisation known as Grattan's Parliament. It was led by Henry Grattan in its origin point, and that's the government that exists between 1782 and the Act of Union of 1800. It's this freed up, more kind of capacious version of an Irish Protestant Parliament. There's some degree of urbanisation and there's some degree of industrialisation, particularly in the northeast corner. Belfast is really where the driver is. Cork is also emerging as a industrial, or as a commercial city. It's very much engaged in the imperial trade. And so these 2 points of contact, you're seeing urbanisation. But Ireland still remains a very dominantly agrarian society. It's very much to do with how the countryside is working and how its economy is thriving, as to whether or not the society is doing well. It's not until the mid-19th century really that you're starting to see serious industrialisation and the development of larger scale urban centres. But Belfast and Cork are certainly starting to thrive alongside the governmentality world of Dublin. So there's the emergence of what in Britain is termed the middling sort, and there's a degree of that taking place in Ireland too. That said, you have to remember that there's also quite a large, extensive kind of migration that's been going on. There's a feed through from 1720s onwards of Ulster Presbyterians moving to America. This is part of the cultural exchange that you're seeing that connects, if you like, the crisis of the 1780s in Ireland with the crisis in America. These are familial contacts. These are letters moving backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, people going forwards across the Atlantic. But you are seeing the emergence of a kind of middling sort in Ireland by the end of the 18th century. In particular, what you're seeing is the development of a Catholic middle class, which is quite striking. And this is partly about the trade links that have been connecting up Ireland into Europe. It's that community that is in fact starting to seriously radicalise in the late 18th century. And it's that group that moves from a position of being Jacobite sympathisers in the early 18th century to being much more connected to a kind of radical politics that we associate with the French Revolution by the 1790s. There are some substantial differences. By 1785, the Jacobite threat has largely dissipated. The end of the kind of lineage has ensured that that political threat has kind of somewhat disappeared. You're getting the emergence in a figure of a kind of Catholic loyalism that's partly being developed. So there's some degree of rapprochement between the Irish Catholic elite community and the Dublin parliamentary world of Protestant Ireland. So there's that significant change, is the kind of decline and fall of the Jacobite world. Ireland has become much more plugged into the British imperial landscape. So the ways in which places like Cork and Belfast and Dublin are feeding into the imperial economy is quite significant. And that's not just to do with kind of putting kind of trade goods onto ships. It's to do with the Irish engagement with the slave trade. It's to do with the ways in which Ireland is thinking of itself less in relation to Europe and more in terms of the Atlantic world. So I think there's quite a degree of imaginative shift taking place in this period as well. In terms of the politics, more formally, the Irish Penal Code has been constructed, and they've stopped adding to that kind of list of regulations and restrictions. And there's now, by the 1770s, a distinct movement to try and tear down many of these penal laws. The Irish volunteer movement commits itself in large part to the disestablishment of many of the penal legislative measures that had kind of acted as a bulwark of the confessional state in Ireland. And that's a radical reimagining of the relationship that is potentially taking place in Ireland amongst the religious communities of the island.